I'm very happy to see many familiar faces, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present some of the results of my Pronoi research project. So as you can see from the title, I focused my research on Claudius Ptolemy, a very important Greek astronomer from the 2nd century AD. And he's mainly known for his Almagest, his great astronomical treatise, but Ptolemy was also the author of a lot of tables. This is a format that had great success in antiquity, and the work that we call handy tables is a set of astronomical, geographical, and chronological tables composed by Ptolemy. One very important aspect of his conception of science in the broad sense was to conceive treatises and works that must be user-friendly, easily transmitted, and potentially ameliorated by readers and later scholars. The Ptolemy's original composition of the handy tables has undergone many transformations throughout its history, but we now have a good idea of the tables that were part of his original set. So as you can see in this list, Ptolemy established 20 astronomical tables, one chronological table, the Table of Kings, and one geographical table, the so-called Table of Noteworthy Cities or Important Cities. Ptolemy's astronomical tables rely on a fundamental principle. They describe the motion of celestial bodies from a chronological starting point determined by Ptolemy himself. This principle is very clear with the words of Theon of Alexandria, also a late antique commentator of Ptolemy, which I quote. So Theon says, since the present set of the handy tables, which contain the motions of the stars, had to be based beforehand on a certain time and of the position occupied by the stars at that moment, since the origin of a motion is both a place and a time, Ptolemy established these tables from the first year of Philip, the successor of Alexander the founder, according to the Egyptians, for whom the duration of the year is only 365 days, at the first day of Thoth at noon, that is to say, when the 6th hour is completed and the 7th begins, for our Alexandria of Egypt. So we have the chronological origin of the tables, the first day of Thoth at noon, the first year of Philip, the successor of Alexander the Great. This date corresponds for us to 12th of November, 324 BC. In the Almagest, however, the beginning of the tables is the first day of Thoth, the first year of Nabonassar, Babylonian king, whose first regnal year started for us on the 26th of February, 747 BC. So as you can see, Ptolemy for his handy tables chose a more recent date as a starting point, precisely the first year of Philip, which is the year 425 of Nabonassar. Ptolemy established his tables using the Egyptian calendar. So I should say a couple of words about the calendars that play a role here. The Egyptian year has exactly 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 additional days called epagomenai at the end of the year. The Egyptian year begins on the first day of Thoth. The Julian calendar used in Rome at the time of Ptolemy has 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 or 31 days. And of course, with February having only 28 days. And every 4 years, we have a leap year, and the Julian year has 366 days. So the Egyptian calendar shifts by 1 day every 4 years compared to the Julian calendar. So in order to count most efficiently the Egyptian years elapsed since the beginning of the reign of Philip, Ptolemy inserts in his collection of the handy tables a chronological table, the one which we call Table of Kings. One finds this table under different names in the academic literature: Table of Reigns, Canon of Kings, and so on. But there is no standard name or title in the manuscripts. And Ptolemy himself mentioned it under a rather lengthy designation, which is the preliminary table or auxiliary table of the chronography of the kings from the origin. So this name was not very convenient to use, and the most common designations in the manuscripts and the late antique commentaries are Table of Kings, Basileon, or Table of Reigns, Basileion. Of course, we can translate canon or canonion by canon in English, but it means basically table. And I use kings because the word is used by Ptolemy, but let's say that it is only one option. So just a quick remark on the term procanonion used by Ptolemy. The term can be understood as preliminary or auxiliary table, and it shows that for Ptolemy, it is a tool that is convenient, but not mandatory. The users of the handy tables can count as they want the years elapsed since the beginning of the reign of Philip. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of chronological scholia in astronomical manuscripts, which present conversions between the eras of Nabonassar, Philip, Augustus, Diocletian, and the years since the creation, make no mention of the Table of Kings. So how did Ptolemy construct this Table of Kings? Ptolemy's purpose is not to record the precise length of each reign, but rather to allow each full Egyptian year to be identified by calling it the nth year of a particular king, or maybe I should say of a particular ruler, since the list also includes a few women like Cleopatra, of course, and in later Byzantine versions of the table, Irene or Theodora. So each ruler's name is followed by two numbers, one giving the regnal years and the other giving the total of the years and those of the predecessors. So the list begins with Nabonassar, hence the second number may also be conceived as a succession of years in the era of Nabonassar. Here on the folio you have the part from Nabonassar to Alexander the Great. The totals begin afresh with the reign of Philip, so that for the Ptolemies and the Roman emperors, the totals express their respective last years in the era of Philip. The names of the rulers are most of the time in the genitive case, so we should hence understand the entries as years of Nabonassar, years of Cyrus, years of Hadrian, and so on. The main element of the table is indeed the number of years, not the name of the ruler. However, in many manuscripts, we find a version of the table where names are in the nominative case. I do not have a straightforward explanation. Sometimes in the same exemplar, you have a part in the genitive, then in the nominative, then in the genitive again. Well, let's say that it can at least help us to detect historical steps of textual transmission. So as you remember, we work with full Egyptian years. And of course, it is very rare, if not unseen, that a king dies precisely on the last day of the Egyptian year. It would be too easy. So the principle is that if an Egyptian year is not finished when the king dies, then this unfinished year is assigned in its totality to the successor and becomes year one of the successor. So the principle is easy, but in fact, especially for the section of the table dealing with Babylonian kings, it raises some questions. The table is arranged according to the Egyptian calendar, a calendar that was hardly congruent with the Babylonian calendar, since they disagree in every way. If precise dates of accession of Babylonian kings had been available, there would have had to be a conversion of such dates. We don't know whether Ptolemy received this list as it is, or if he himself converted dates from the Babylonian to the Egyptian calendar. Anyway, if we follow specialists of the question, the fact is that the correspondence works as well as it does between the Babylonian sources we have and Ptolemy's Table of Kings. It works also for Roman emperors, but with a few exceptions. So Ptolemy's composition, whether he relied heavily on earlier sources or not, most probably included kings of Babylon from Nabonassar, then the Persian rulers from Cyrus, starting from his conquest of Babylon, down to Alexander the Great, then the Hellenistic rulers of Egypt until Cleopatra, then the Roman emperors from Augustus when he conquered Egypt, and certainly until the Emperor Antoninus, since we know that a part of the Almagest was composed under his reign. Of course, in all of the extant manuscripts, the Table of Kings has been continued to the Byzantine emperors and sometimes until the fall of Constantinople. But the part of the table after Antoninus was, of course, later additions to Ptolemy's work. So the Table of Kings is the only chronological table belonging to Ptolemy's original set of tables, but we don't have a critical edition of it based on an investigation of old testimonies. And we know very little about its textual history. The only modern editions we have are, in fact, transcriptions of the table from a couple of manuscripts, so the situation was quite unsatisfying. I aim to produce a critical edition of Ptolemy's Table of Kings and to investigate how this table circulated in Greek-speaking areas from Ptolemy to our manuscripts. So I managed to identify 33 manuscript witnesses of Ptolemy's Table of Kings. In a few cases, only fragmentary. Sometimes in the same codex, you will have two exemplars of the table. I suspect that other witnesses are still to be discovered because astronomical and chronological tables are usually very poorly identified and described in the manuscript catalogs of the libraries. And in several cases, I came across an exemplar of the table just by chance. So I guess that this list is still open. Some exemplars do not have the part of the table from Nabonassar to Alexander the Great. Some begin only with Philip, and all of them extend much later than Ptolemy's lifetime, and in one case, even after the fall of Constantinople. Among these witnesses, 4 of them are most important since they were written during the 9th century, very certainly in Constantinople, and most of the later exemplars can be traced back to these 4 witnesses. So the challenge of establishing a stemma of the manuscript, that is, defining the relations between the manuscript witnesses of the table, is that these documents evolved massively since Ptolemy. We have contamination between exemplars, we have scribes who modified and corrected the text and the numbers. This is a very common phenomenon for any kind of text written in antiquity and transmitted to us, but in the case of the Table of Kings, almost every exemplar of the table can be considered as a single unique document with several authors. So let's take an example. The oldest exemplars usually show several layers of additions with one or several scribes who completed and or corrected the table. Here you have the table in the Plutarchus 2826 manuscript now in Florence, which begins with Philip, the successor of Alexander the Great. Here you see the section written by the main scribe of the Codex at the end of the 9th century. The last entry is Leo, the Emperor Leo the Wise, so without the years. So the activity of the scribe certainly took place under his reign, and indeed other internal evidence in the Codex confirm this date. Then a later scribe completed the table from Leo to Constantine Monomachos, so with the dark brown ink here. A third completed from Theodora to Alexios I with the lighter brown ink. And a fourth scribe completed from John II to John VIII, and a last scribe added the name with the blue ink, added the name of Constantine Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor. So as you can see, this exemplar of the Table of Kings went through more than 5 centuries of Byzantine history. What I want to show with this example is that the value for us of Ptolemy's Table of Kings lies, of course, in the comprehension of how astronomy and chronology were performed during Ptolemy's lifetime, but also in what it tells us about the transmission, the circulation, and the reception of scientific documents over a very long period. That's why in my project, I investigated what was needed to make a critical edition of the table, but also to grasp the different steps of its textual transmission to see how scholars at different periods dealt with this chronological material. So to visualize the relations between the manuscript, I made a sort of stemma. It is not a stemma codicum in the strict sense. It is more a diagram that aims at representing both the relations between the witnesses and the textual history. Some of the witnesses appear several times when we have different layers of completing. So a small group of manuscripts was written during the 9th century, but the vast majority, and that is not a surprise, date back from the first half of the 14th century. During the early Paleologan era, we see a sort of revival of Ptolemy's astronomy, with scholars and groups of scholars interested in the works of Ptolemy, producing several commentaries and abundant marginal notes in the manuscripts. During this period, we see the production of versions of Ptolemy's Table of Kings, which are actual editions, combining different manuscripts and different versions of the table. Another important step of the manuscript transmission took place in the middle of the 15th century, with scribes completing extant exemplars, but also bringing Greek manuscripts to Italy. So to trace back the transmission and diffusion of the Table of Kings, I combined different sort of sources. Of course, from the 9th century onward, we can heavily rely on the testimonies of the Byzantine manuscript themselves. But we can also use the commentaries on the handy tables. Several important commentators gave useful information about the use of the Table of Kings, like Theon of Alexandria, we quote earlier. We have also mentions and quotations from the Table of Kings in non-astronomical contexts, such as historical and chronographic works. Then we have scholia, mostly anonymous in astronomical manuscripts of Ptolemy or Theon, who mention the table. But we have also quotations found in Syriac texts, like the Chronicle of Ilia of Nisibis, or in Arabic works like the work of Al-Biruni. The challenge was to combine these different sources of information. But I will not present everything today, do not worry. Theon of Alexandria is our first milestone in the second half of the 4th century. He wrote 2 commentaries on the handy tables, a long one and a shorter one. Theon was an Alexandrian astronomer in the pure tradition of Ptolemy, and his commentary gives us examples of how the Table of Kings should be properly used. So I will quote Theon. Let us suppose as a date the 77th year since the beginning of the reign of Diocletian, the 22nd of Thoth at 11 o'clock of the day. Thus, from the beginning of the reign of Philip to that of Diocletian, we count 607 years, as it is clear from the totals in the table of reigns. If, adding to that the 77 years given since the beginning of Diocletian, we carry back the sum of the 684 years in the first column, then etc., etc. So the manuscript of Theon usually give table of reigns, but a part of the tradition also gives table of kings. Then the numerical values given here are perfectly concordant with the table of kings as we know it from the manuscript. And obviously, Theon had access to an exemplar of the table completed at least until Diocletian. In the literature, you can sometimes find that Theon was the author of a new edition of Ptolemy's handy tables. His role in the transmission of the work is not clear, but we do have elements pointing toward a step in the textual transmission during the second half of the 4th century. And among these elements, we have a series of scholia around the Table of Kings that mention astronomers in relation to the kings under whose reign they lived. So Meton and Euctemon of Athens, Timocharis of Alexandria, Conon of Samos, Hipparchus, Ptolemy, and Pappus. So these scholia, transmitted by different branches of the tradition, so you have here one very late example, go back perhaps to a relatively old state of the text. The most recent astronomer on the list is Pappus, a generation before Theon of Alexandria. So of course it is tempting to see in these glosses or in part of them the intervention of an astronomer later than Pappus, well acquainted with the history of his discipline, but not mentioning Theon. So maybe Theon himself or an astronomer contemporary with him, like his daughter Hypatia, I don't know. In any case, these scholia show that Ptolemy's Table of Kings was not only used as a tool for astronomical computation, but also, and quite early, as a sort of document of the history of science by placing famous astronomers on a sort of timeline, which is not a function of the table foreseen by Ptolemy. A new aspect or a new role of Ptolemy's Table of Kings appeared at the same period, the late 4th century, always in Alexandria. At this time, there was a strong interest in world chronology or chronography in the wake of Eusebius of Caesarea. In this context, we find Ptolemy's table used by a Greek monk called Panodoros. We do not know very much about him. We know he was the author of a work on world chronography, which we know almost exclusively from the later work of George Syncellus, a Byzantine chronicler of the 8th century, who used Panodoros extensively. And as far as we can reconstruct Panodoros' work, it appears clearly that he had access to Ptolemy's astronomical treatises and that he used the Table of Kings as a document at the service of a broader enterprise, such as world chronography. And Panodoros is the first, to my knowledge, to identify some Babylonian kings in Ptolemy's table with kings mentioned in the Bible. For instance, Nabonassar with Shalmaneser or Nabokolassar with Nebuchadnezzar. He also modified some durations of the reigns, certainly with the help of the biblical text or Christian chroniclers. And at the end, Panodoros made an edition of Ptolemy's Table of Kings, which was taken over by George Syncellus under the title Years from Nabonassar, that is Shalmaneser, king of the Chaldeans, until the death of Alexander the Founder, according to the astronomical table. So at this point of the story, Ptolemy's Table of Kings plainly entered the realm of Christian chronography, and in fact, it is thanks to Panodoros, later quoted by George Syncellus, that Ptolemy's Table of Kings is known to Western Europe. It is because scholars like Scaliger, who knew Syncellus' work, began to actively search for a Greek manuscript of the Table of Kings that we have had the first printed editions of the table in the early 17th century. Of course, plenty of Greek manuscripts of Ptolemy's tables had already reached Italy, France, and England by Scaliger's time, but without arousing much interest. After Scaliger, we find printed editions of the Table of Kings in London, Paris, and Germany during the 17th century, but almost always in works dealing with chronology and not astronomy. So I made a split between the 4th century in Alexandria and modern European history, showing that the Table of Kings, originally a tool for astronomers, had a sort of second or alternative life thanks to specialists of chronology. But what about the Greek manuscript of Ptolemy's handy tables? We know that Ptolemy's handy tables and the Table of Kings had reached the capital city of the Byzantine Empire at least by the early 7th century. And then we have two important moments. moments in the history of this table. First, during the reigns of Leo IV, Constantine VI, and Irene, to the last quarter of the 8th century, we have several dated scholia on the Table of Kings. They mostly deal with conversions of the era of Philip and the Byzantine calendar, but also dealing with the position of the sun and the moon. And the second important moment is the first 2 decades of the 9th century, with a copy of exemplars and one of them being a very luxury codex. If I insist on this period, so the last quarter of the 8th and the first quarter of the 9th century, it is because they are traditionally regarded as periods of decline of sciences, at a moment where the great intellectual and political question is iconoclasm. But we do see traces of astronomical and astrological activity several generations before the so-called Macedonian Renaissance in the second half of the 9th century. Then a tendency developed from the 10th century and is amplified in the 14th century, which is the continuation of the Table of Kings, not with a count of Egyptian years, but with precise records of the length of the emperor's reign in years, months, and sometimes days. Not in every manuscript, but in some of them. This is a complete transformation of the scientific purpose of this table. Instead of being used as an astronomical tool, the Table of Kings became a historical document that can be compared to very abridged epitomes of Byzantine chronicles. We saw that Panodoros in the 4th century used the Table of Kings for chronology, but as a source. Here, what we have in later Byzantine manuscripts is a transformation of the table itself. During the early Paleologan period, or more generally speaking, during the first half of the 14th century, many manuscripts were copied, but I will not present them. Instead, I will jump to the first half of the 15th century, because I would like to present briefly, very briefly, the work of John Kortasmenos. Kortasmenos was a Byzantine scholar with a keen interest in mathematics and astronomy. We have his edition of the Table of Kings in a manuscript written by him, now preserved at the Vatican Library. So he aimed to connect the chronology based on the Bible and the years counted from the creation of the world to the succession of rulers of Ptolemy's list. So he added to his table a sort of introduction explaining how he worked, and I will read it. Take notice of this. We made the exposition of the chronological list in the present table by adding the years, not in a random and haphazard way, but first by consulting the different books that received the greatest reliability according to the knowledge of the authors. Then we made ourselves all the calculations one by one with precision and found that they all agree with the treatises of Ptolemy, Theon, Stephanos the Alexandrian, Metochites the Grand Logothetes, and also Meliteniotis, the Grand Sacellarius. So first, Kortasmenos merged the Table of Kings with a chronology from Adam. The pivot of his new table is the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who Kortasmenos identified with Nabonassar. Then Kortasmenos modified the structure of the table by adding a new column for the count of the years since the creation of the world. It is the column to the left. He made a new title, new headings, and provided short introduction from which I show you the beginning. He also added elements to make the use of the table easier for astronomical computations. And fortunately for him, Kortasmenos had access to an exemplar of the Table of Kings, which reveals to be quite good compared to other manuscripts of this period, which show continuations of various quality. So he made a very good scholarly work, and as far as I could check, the sum of the years since Philip that he found at the end of the table, of his table, deviates only by 1 year from what we could calculate today. So once again, compared to the rest of the manuscript tradition, this is a very strong achievement. So throughout the 15th century, several generations of Greek scholars left the capital city of the Byzantine Empire and moved to the Despotate of the Morea or to Italy. And the manuscripts of Ptolemy's Table of Kings followed the same path. To my knowledge, the first manuscript of the Table of Kings copied in Western Europe was made in Florence during the Council of 1439. So to conclude, I hope that I could convince you that even rather dry lists of names and numbers, like the tables of Ptolemy, can attest to a certain diversity in time computing approaches and a porosity between different fields like astronomy, historical writings, Christian chronology, which have different objectives. And it is thanks to the testimony of the Byzantine codices and of a variety of readers of Ptolemy's text that we are now able to understand better Ptolemy's project and how this table circulated and was reappropriated in various contexts. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, Ptolemy took great care of how his treatises and tables would be transmitted, but I'm not sure that he anticipated that his Table of Kings would be used outside of the astronomical computing, and that a very important part of the transmission would have been realized by Christian chroniclers. I should stop here and thank you for your attention.